Welcome to the deep dive. Forget the endless scroll and, all that information overload. Today, we're really zeroing in on something pretty fundamental. Understanding how to build a solid argument.
Right. And just as importantly, how to spot one that's maybe a bit shaky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You sent us some really interesting material that gets right to the heart of argumentative writing. It shows how it all starts. Way before you even type the first sentence, it's really about digging in, evaluating evidence, and figuring out what you've actually got.
Yeah, and this isn't just about writing essays for school or something. It's about how we persuade each other, how we make our points in everyday life, really. The sources you shared really highlight that an argument, well, at its core, it's the result of some pretty careful investigation. It's not just a random opinion you throw out there.
And for you, our listener, if you want to get up to speed on important topics without getting totally bogged down, this is kind of designed as your shortcut.
Yeah.
Your way to understand the power and maybe the pitfalls of argumentation.
We're pulling out the essential stuff, the structure, the purpose, the logical engine that makes a strong argument actually work.
So our mission today is pretty simple. We want to give you a solid grasp of what a well-reasoned argument looks like, why it matters so much in a world just full of claims flying around, and how you can confidently approach both building your own arguments and, picking apart the ones you hear from others.
Okay, so where do we start? How do we make sense of all this?
Well, a natural starting point seems to be thinking about why we even bother making an argument in the first place. Your sources point out the basic aim is, well, to convince someone.
Right. Exactly. To bring them around to your way of seeing things. I mean, this could be about agreeing on certain facts, or maybe sharing particular values, or just accepting a conclusion because the evidence points that way.
Right. It's not just about shouting your opinion louder, like you said. It's constructing a case that can actually maybe change someone's mind, or at least help them understand a different perspective.
And one of the powerful aims mentioned is undermining prejudices. That's about shifting some potentially deeply held beliefs, which is, well, that's significant.
Yeah.
But
And that connects to this idea of adopting a way of thinking. A really good argument isn't just about winning a point. It's about fostering a deeper understanding, potentially leading to a real shift in how someone sees an issue.
Okay, so every argument needs that central point, the claim. The sources call it the thesis statement. What's the key to making a claim that's, actually worth arguing about?
The crucial thing really is that a strong claim needs to be specific. And super importantly, it has to be debatable within its field or context. It can't just be like thin air. It needs to be something you can actually support with evidence.
Right.
So when you encounter a claim, a good first step is always to ask yourself, okay, could smart, reasonable people actually disagree about this? And then what kind of evidence would even be relevant here to support it or to challenge it? And also, what info might be missing? Why isn't it there?
That makes a lot of sense. It can't be something everyone just accepts as true already. Or, like you said, something so vague you wouldn't even know where to start looking for evidence. The sources had a couple of good examples.
Yeah.
Like, damage to the ozone layer is probably irreversible.
Yeah.
That's something, reasonable people could debate based on scientific evidence and models.
Right. There's data, there are projections. It's arguable.
But then something like inflation is not good for the economy. Well, most people generally accept that. It's not really a debatable point in quite the same way, is it?
Exactly. So these debatable statements, whether you call them claims, assertions, propositions, premises, whatever, they're the absolute core building blocks. They're the points where different views can exist and where logic and evidence have to come in to try and, sway those views.
Okay, so we've got our debatable claim. Now, how do we actually back it up convincingly? That's where logic enters the picture.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. Logic, as your sources put it, is basically a method of reasoning. It aims to establish truth, or at least likelihood, and weed out sloppy or faulty thinking. It gives us a framework, kind of a set of rules for drawing sound conclusions from the information we have.
Okay. And classical logic is built on three really fundamental ideas, the sources say.
That's right. Super fundamental.
Okay, let's break these down. The first one is the law of identity. A equals A seems pretty obvious.
It is foundational, though. It just means anything is identical to itself. A cat is a cat. Freedom is freedom. Whatever we're talking about, it has its own consistent identity. Mathematically, it's just A equals A, simple.
Right. So this specific podcast episode is this specific podcast episode, not some other one. Got it. What's the second law?
That's the law of non-contradiction. This one says you can't have something be both true and not true at the same time and in the same way. So if we say the microphone is on, We can't also truthfully say at the exact same moment and referring to the same microphone in the same way, the microphone is not on. One has to be false if the other is true.
So something can have a characteristic and, like, simultaneously not have that same characteristic under the same conditions. Makes sense. What about number 3?
The law of excluded middle. This law says that for any given statement, either that statement is true or its negation is true. There's no middle ground, no third option. So for any claim A, either A is true or not A is true, one or the other must hold.
Okay, those 3 laws, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, they really do feel like the absolute bedrock for any kind of rational thinking.
They really are.
Now, how do these, like, super basic principles actually play out when we start building arguments? The sources talk about syllogistic logic, starting with deductive reasoning.
Yes, deductive logic. It's often called top-down reasoning. You start with general statements or premises, and you move towards a specific conclusion. The key thing here, the real power of deduction, is that if your starting premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. It's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are solid.
Wow, that's a pretty strong guarantee. The example given was, all cherries are fruits, a Utah Gold is a cherry, therefore a Utah Gold is a fruit.
Right.
If we accept premise 1, all cherries are fruits, and premise 2, a Utah Gold is a cherry, then the conclusion, it's a fruit, just seems unavoidable.
Exactly. It follows necessarily. The conclusion is essentially contained within the premises. The sources also mention cause-to-effect reasoning within deduction.
Okay.
So if you have a general cause, it will necessarily lead to a specific effect in a specific instance, assuming, all the conditions are met. The example of Jerry's nut allergy illustrates this pretty well.
Right. Jerry is allergic to nuts. That's the general rule. Jerry ate a chocolate bar containing nuts and became sick. Specific instance. Therefore, his sickness was caused by the nuts in the chocolate bar.
If we accept the allergy premise and the eating nuts premise, then the conclusion about the cause of that specific sickness seems necessary in that deductive context. But it's important to remember, as the sources point out, not all situations are quite so clean. They use the example of alcohol and drunkenness.
Oh, okay.
While we generally associate drinking alcohol with getting drunk, it's not a necessary outcome in every single case, right? Someone might drink a little and not get drunk.
Sure.
But if we define a particular instance of drunkenness as being caused specifically by alcohol consumption in that case, then within that narrow definition, the cause is necessarily alcohol. It depends on how tightly you define your terms.
Okay, so the big advantage of deductive logic is this really high level of certainty. If your starting points are good, your conclusion is basically guaranteed. But what's the downside? The sources mentioned it being kind of limited, maybe even circular.
That's the main drawback, yeah. While deduction gives you certainty, it doesn't actually generate brand new knowledge about the world. It mostly just rearranges or clarifies information that was already kind of implicit in your premises. You're not really discovering anything fundamentally new. You're just drawing out specifics from what you already stated generally.
Right. You're moving from the broad to the specific, so you're not really expanding the big picture.
Yep.
Okay, so on the other side of the coin, we have inductive logic, the bottom-up approach. How's that different?
Inductive logic, yeah, it works the opposite way. It starts with specific observations, specific instances, and tries to build towards broader, general conclusions.
Okay.
But because our experience of the world is always, limited, we can't observe everything everywhere all the time. The conclusions we draw through induction are generally considered probable rather than absolutely certain, like in deduction.
So it's more about making a strong, educated guess based on the patterns we see. The sources contrast deductive arguments being valid or invalid with inductive ones being strong or weak.
Exactly. The strength of an inductive argument really depends on how well the specific observations actually support the general conclusion you're trying to draw. The more relevant examples you have, the more consistent they are, the stronger your inductive argument becomes. They give an example of reasoning from effect back to a likely cause. We've seen a 20% jump in deaths recorded as alcohol poisoning. Therefore, it's likely that overall alcohol consumption is rising.
Okay, so we see the effect, more deaths reported, and we infer a probable cause, more drinking. But the source immediately points out, and this is crucial, that might not be the only reason.
Right. Maybe the way deaths are tracked or reported has changed. Maybe awareness is higher. There could be other factors. That really highlights the inherent uncertainty, or at least lack of absolute certainty, in induction.
Yeah.
Inductive conclusions are probable, sometimes highly probable, but they're never logically guaranteed in the way deductive ones are. The source even points out that what we think of as scientific reasoning is fundamentally inductive.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, scientists observe patterns, they form hypotheses, which are essentially general explanations based on specific observations, and then they design experiments to gather more evidence to either support or potentially refute those hypotheses.
Right.
That's why repeatability is so critical in science. If multiple independent experiments show the same result, it strengthens the inductive case for the hypothesis.
And even with tons of supporting evidence, a single counterexample could, in theory, overturn a strong inductive conclusion. The purple cow example really drives this home.
Yeah, the classic example. We might have seen thousands, millions of cows, all black and white or brown or whatever. We inductively conclude all cows are non-purple. It seems incredibly strong based on our experience.
Right.
But then, if just one genuinely purple cow shows up, well, our generalization is instantly proven false.
So that's the risk with induction.
Right.
But the big advantage, the sources say, is that it's much more likely to lead to genuinely new ideas, new insights about the world, even if those insights can't be proven with that absolute deductive certainty.
Exactly. It's where new knowledge often comes from.
Okay, so deduction. Certainty, but maybe no new info. Induction. Potential for new info, but always with some degree of uncertainty. That's a really useful distinction. Now, the sources dive into different types of syllogisms and some common fallacies, those sneaky errors in reasoning. Let's start with conditional statement, the if-then kind.
Right. Conditional statements, if P, then Q, are super common in arguments. The sources break down 4 key patterns, 2 of which are valid ways to reason and 2 of which are common fallacies.
Okay, let's tackle them one by one. First is modus ponens, also called affirming the antecedent. That's explained as if P, then QP is true, therefore Q must be true. The example is, if you are in New Delhi, P, then you are in India, Q. I am in New Delhi, P, therefore I must be in India, Q.
That feels solid.
It is. It's a valid deductive form. If the if part, the antecedent P, is true, and the whole if-then relationship holds, then the then part, the consequent Q, absolutely has to be true.
Okay, now the first fallacy is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. That's structured as, if P, then QQ is true, therefore P must be true.
Right.
Using the same example, if you are in New Delhi, then you are in India. I am in India Q, therefore I am in New Delhi P. This is flagged as invalid. Why doesn't that work?
Because the then part, being in India, could be true for lots of reasons other than the if part, being in New Delhi, being true. Like the source says, New Delhi is just one city within India. Being in the bigger set, India, doesn't automatically mean you're in that specific subset, New Delhi. Right, you could be in Mumbai or Chennai or anywhere else in India. Okay. What about modus tollens? That's negating the consequent. If P, then Q. Q's not true, therefore P is not true. Example. If you are in New Delhi, then you are in India. I am not in India, not Q, therefore I cannot be in New Delhi, not P.
That also seems logically tight.
It is. That's another valid deductive form. If the whole if-then statement is true, and the then part turns out to be false, then the if part must also be false.
Yeah.
If you're not in India, you definitely can't be in a specific city that's located within India.
Makes sense. And the last one is the fallacy of denying the antecedent. If P, then QP is not true, therefore Q is not true.
Another common mistake.
The example, if you are in New Delhi, then you are in India. I am not in New Delhi, not P, therefore I cannot be in India, not Q. And this one is also invalid. Correct. Just because the if part, being in New Delhi, is false, doesn't automatically make the then part, being in India, false. Again, you could be not in New Delhi, but still be somewhere else within India. Not being in P doesn't logically force not Q in this structure.
Wow. Getting these 4 straight modus ponens and modus tollens are valid. Affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent are fallacies that seems really key for analyzing if-then arguments.
It really is. They pop up everywhere once you start looking.
The sources then move to sufficient and necessary conditions. What's the difference there?
Okay, so a sufficient condition, let's call it P, is something that, if it's present, guarantees that another thing Q will happen. If P is true, Q must be true. P is enough for Q.
Okay, P is enough. Got it.
A necessary condition, on the other hand, means P is essential for Q to occur. You absolutely need P for Q to happen. If P isn't present, Q cannot happen.
So necessary means you must have it. How do we test these? How do we argue against someone claiming something is sufficient or necessary?
Good question. To refute the claim that P is sufficient for Q, You need to find just one example, a counterexample where P is true, but Q is false.
Ah, okay.
To refute the claim that P is necessary for Q, you need a counterexample where Q is true, even though P is false.
The sources use the fire example.
Mm.
Heat and oxygen are necessary for fire, no fire without them, but they aren't sufficient alone. You also need fuel.
Exactly. But having heat, fuel, and oxygen together is generally considered a sufficient condition for fire. If you have all three, you'll get fire.
And the source also notes that if something is both necessary and sufficient, the if-then works both ways, right?
Precisely. If P is both necessary and sufficient for Q, then Q is true, and D, if Q, then P is also true. They call this a biconditional. The examples they give for refutation are helpful too.
Yeah, like getting a B on an essay, even though you worked really hard. That shows hard work isn't sufficient for getting an A.
Right. It might help, it might often lead to an A, but it doesn't guarantee it.
And getting an A without working particularly hard shows that intense hard work isn't strictly necessary for getting an A. Other factors might come into play.
Exactly. Those real-world examples show how we can test these claims about sufficiency and necessity.
This is all super helpful for taking apart the logic. Now, the sources also list 6 key signs or characteristics of a good argument. What are those?
Okay, so first, a strong argument generally rests on a solid foundation of factual support, real evidence. Second, it shows a high degree of coherence, internal consistency. The pieces fit together logically, they don't contradict each other.
Okay.
Third, it should have explanatory power. It should help us understand why the claim is likely true, not just that it is.
Right.
Fourth, it tends to avoid extremes, being neither overly simplistic nor excessively complicated for no good reason, finding that right level.
Balance.
Fifth, it's often strengthened when you have cumulative evidence from multiple independent lines of reasoning or sources, all pointing towards the same conclusion.
Converging evidence.
Exactly. And finally, number 6, a really good argument usually doesn't shy away from counterarguments. It acknowledges opposing views and addresses them effectively, refuting them or showing why its own position is stronger.
That last one feels really important. It shows you've actually thought about the other side, not just ignored it.
Definitely builds credibility.
So what makes an issue actually arguable? We can't argue about everything, can we?
No, and the sources give some good criteria. First, and maybe most obviously, reasonable people could actually disagree about it. If it's a settled fact, there's no argument to be had.
Like the capital of France is Paris. Not really arguable.
Right. Second, the issue needs to be, in some way, susceptible to proof or evidence. The source used the example of, what Shakespeare really thought about his audience's shoes or something. We can speculate, but without any actual evidence, it's not really an arguable point in a meaningful way. It's just guesswork. And third, the issue should ideally be compelling. It should matter to the arguer, and it should matter, or be made to matter, to the audience. There should be some stakes, some relevance.
The sources mentioned issues ripped from the headlines, but also long-standing historical debates, or even uncovering things that were hidden or claims that haven't really been tested before.
Yeah, it shows that arguments aren't just academic exercises. They often deal with things that have real significance.
Okay, so let's say we're faced with an argumentative article or book chapter. What are some practical steps the sources suggest for reading and understanding it well?
They suggest a kind of structured approach. Even before you start reading properly, they recommend scanning the title, the intro, the conclusion, get the lay of the land. Try to quickly summarize what you think the main point is. Note down your own initial reaction or opinion. And crucially, identify the main claim, the thesis, and any counterclaims mentioned early on.
So kind of like creating a mental map before you dive in.
Exactly. It primes you for what to look for. Then, during the reading, the advice is to read it through once just to get the overall flow and gist.
Okay.
Then go back and read it more carefully. This time, take notes, maybe highlight key terms or main points, and actively look for areas of common ground if different viewpoints are being presented.
What if the material is really dense or complex?
Yeah, for tricky stuff, the source even suggests maybe reading it once without stressing too much about understanding every single detail. Then do a second pass, specifically looking for complex terms or ideas, maybe define them. Then reread those sections and try to summarize them in your own words. It breaks it down.
That sounds like a good strategy for tackling difficult texts.
Yeah.
And after we've finished reading, What then?
After reading, it's really important to check your own understanding. Did you grasp the core argument? Then analyze how the argument was built. What kind of evidence did they use? How was it structured? What logical steps did they take? Then try to articulate your own position on the issue now that you've engaged with the text. Compare your view to the author's. And finally, ask yourself if you need more information. Should you look for other sources to get a fuller picture?
This whole systematic approach before, during, and after reading seems incredibly useful for really getting inside an argument. Now, let's flip the coin. Writing our own arguments. Where do we start if we want to persuade someone?
Well, again, the sources really emphasize the prep work before you write. You need to think hard about your audience. Who are you trying to convince? What do they already believe? What are their values? What kind of evidence or reasoning might actually resonate with them?
So, audience analysis is key.
Huge. Keeping a journal, brainstorming ideas, doing some focused reading, all part of that pre-writing. And of course, you need that genuinely arguable issue we talked about, something that isn't settled, where experts might disagree, where you can actually develop a position and find evidence to support it.
Right? Not something everyone already agrees on or something impossible to prove. What other key ingredients do we need?
Well, beyond the issue, you need to be clear about your role as the arguer. You're taking a stand. You need a specific claim you're going to defend. You need to anticipate what people might say against it, the counter-arguments, and be ready to respond. And you need to wrap it up clearly.
Okay.
And again, thinking about the audience. Are they likely to be friendly, hostile, neutral? How much common ground do you need to build? Creating a sense of like a safe, respectful space for the argument is also important.
The sources briefly mention different types of arguments too, like debates, trials, dialogues, essays, one-on-one discussions. It's interesting how the format can change things.
Yeah, the goals and rules can shift depending on the context.
And then there are these things called critical thinking prompts. What are those about? They sound useful.
They are. They're basically a list of different ways to think about an issue more deeply before you even form your main argument. It's like a toolkit for exploration.
Okay, like what?
Things like associate it with other ideas, describe it in detail, compare and contrast it, apply it to a situation, divide it into parts, argue for it, argue against it, think about how it relates to today, how it's changed over time, analyze its causes or effects, evaluate its importance, elaborate with examples, predict future outcomes. And maybe the most important one, just keep asking why. Why is this the case? Why does this assumption hold?
Wow, that's a comprehensive list. It sounds like using those prompts would really force you to understand an issue inside and out before taking a stand.
Exactly. It helps you develop that nuanced understanding.
The sources also suggest a way to analyze existing arguments. Survey it first, title, intro, conclusion, headings, then divide it into logical chunks, analyze the order, and see how the parts connect to the main idea.
Yeah, breaking it down structurally.
And you can't build an argument without evidence. What kinds do the sources focus on?
They made a key distinction between circumstantial and direct evidence. Direct evidence is something like, an eyewitness seeing something happen. It can potentially stand on its own. Circumstantial evidence relies more on inference. You have facts A and B, and you infer that C must be true because of A and B. It's indirect.
So like finding someone's fingerprints at a crime scene is circumstantial evidence they were there, but not direct evidence they committed the crime itself.
Exactly. Now, circumstantial evidence can be weak if the link is flimsy, but it can become very strong if you have multiple different pieces of circumstantial evidence all pointing in the same direction. The cumulative effect matters.
Right. One piece might not convince you, but 5 pieces fitting together might. It's interesting the source notes that even direct evidence in the real world rarely gives that absolute 100% certainty you might find in pure logic.
Yeah, the standard is often beyond a reasonable doubt, not absolute proof.
The sources then quickly list other argument types based on evidence or reasoning, deduction, definition, cause, sign, statistics, analogy, authority, motivation. And importantly, they hint that each have potential weaknesses.
Right, like arguments about cause need to be careful not to confuse correlation with causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other.
Good point. And arguments from analogy comparing two things are only as strong as the relevance of the similarities, right?
Precisely. Is it a fair comparison in the ways that matter for the argument? And arguments from authority, they depend entirely on whether the authority figure actually is a credible expert on that specific topic.
Yeah, famous actor telling you which running shoes to buy. maybe not the best authority.
Probably not. So being aware of these potential weak spots is crucial, both when you're building your own arguments and when you're listening to others.
The sources also classify claims. Claims of fact. Did something happen? Definition, what is it? Cause, why did it happen? Value, is it good or bad? And policy, what should we do? Understanding the type of claim helps focus the argument.
Definitely. It tells you what kind of support is needed.
And then the writing process itself. Pre-writing, drafting, and post-writing with those key post-writing steps like reading critically, getting feedback, revising. All essential.
Can't skip the revision.
Okay, now for the really fun part. Fallacies. Those common reasoning errors that mess up arguments.
Yes, the pitfalls. The sources distinguish between formal fallacies, problems with the logical structure, and informal fallacies, which are errors in the content, relevance, or language used.
And within informal fallacies, there are ones based on ambiguity, unclear language, and ones based on relevance.
Yeah.
The evidence doesn't actually support the conclusion.
Right. Let's maybe touch on a few examples.
Yeah, under ambiguity, there's equivocation using a keyword with different meanings.
Like shifting the definition of man or strength mid-argument.
And amphibole, where the grammar makes the sentence unclear. The classic example, I shot an elephant in my pajamas.
Right? How he got in your pajamas, I'll never know. And then there's accent or emphasis, where stressing different words changes the meaning. You shouldn't steal office supplies versus you shouldn't steal office supplies.
Okay, those rely on tricky language. What about fallacies of relevance, where the reasoning itself is flawed?
Oh, there are many of these. The false dilemma or false dichotomy, pretending there are only two choices when there might be more.
Like, you're either with us or against us.
Exactly. Then the appeal to ignorance, arguing something is true just because it hasn't been proven false, or vice versa.
No one's proven ghosts don't exist, so they must.
Right. The slippery slope, arguing that one small step will inevitably lead to a terrible chain reaction without enough proof.
If we allow kids to chew gum in school, next they'll be doing drugs.
A complex question fallacy jams two questions into one, forcing a single answer, like, have you stopped cheating on tests? Whether you say yes or no, you seem to admit you were cheating before.
Ooh, tricky.
Appeals to force threats or pity emotions instead of logic. Arguing based on the negative consequences of believing something, rather than whether it's true. Attacking the person, not the argument that's ad hominem or character assassination. Using loaded emotional language, prejudicial appeal. Appeal to popularity. Everyone believes it, so it must be true.
Bandwagon effect.
Appeal to unqualified authority, we mentioned that. False analogy, comparing apples and oranges in an irrelevant way. Hasty generalization, jumping to conclusions from too little evidence. I met two rude New Yorkers, so all New Yorkers must be rude.
Right.
Begging the question or circular reasoning where the premise just assumes the conclusion is true. We must pay taxes because paying taxes is the law. Well, why is it the law?
It doesn't actually prove anything.
The straw man fallacy, misrepresenting your opponent's argument to make it easier to knock down. The fallacy of origins or genetic fallacy, dismissing an idea because of where it came from. Like, that idea came from the 60s, so it must be bad. And a category mistake, putting something in the wrong logical box, like the source's example about flat foundations not meaning a flat world.
Wow. Okay, that is a lot of ways an argument can go wrong.
It is, but just being aware of them, being able to spot them, is a huge step towards becoming a better critical thinker.
Absolutely.
Right.
The sources then give a really helpful list of questions to ask when reading or writing an argument covering the issue. Author's view, evidence, logic, language, assumptions, counterarguments, style, fallacies.
Yeah.
It's like a diagnostic checklist.
Very thorough. It forces you to engage deeply.
And they even use a Hillary Clinton statement as a quick example of spotting a category mistake. Practical application.
And then back to something we touched on earlier, but it's so crucial. Understanding the audience. The sources list questions like, who are they? What do they already believe? How will they interpret this? What motivates them? What style works best? You have to think about who you're talking to.
You can have the most logical argument in the world, but if it doesn't connect with your audience, it might just fall flat.
Precisely. It's not just about logic, it's about persuasion, which involves connecting with people.
The sources also briefly mention argument theory, the rhetorical situation, the context, audience, constraints, author, and the different types of proofs. Logical, credibility-based, emotional, and that invention worksheet for brainstorming ideas.
Yeah, lots of techniques there. Free writing, listing, outlining, using those critical thinking prompts we discussed, looking for cause effect, identifying evidence gaps. All good ways to get started.
They even show how to structure thoughts using for and against points and provide a model essay outline. Very practical.
Gives you a framework.
And finally, they summarize the parts of an argumentative essay, intro, body, conclusion, and stress the importance of research, explaining primary versus secondary sources.
Right. Primary is firsthand accounts or data. Secondary is analysis about primary sources.
And the difference between peer review in academic journals versus, say, journalism.
Yeah, peer review involves experts in the field vetting the work before publication. It's a higher standard for contributing to specialized knowledge, whereas good journalism aims for accuracy and truthfulness for a broader audience. Different goals, different processes.
They list characteristics of peer-reviewed sources and when you typically need them versus when other credible sources might suffice. And they clarify bibliographies versus works cited pages.
Important nuts and bolts for academic work.
And the whole thing wraps up by looking at a sample paper about educating children of undocumented immigrants, pointing out how it uses credibility, states a clear thesis, handles opposing views, uses evidence, maintains a reasonable tone, and cites sources properly.
Yeah, it pulls together a lot of the principles discussed into a concrete example.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up this deep dive. Based on everything we've covered from these sources, what are the absolute key takeaways you'd want our listener to hold on to about arguments?
Well, I think the main thing is that a really strong argument isn't just stating an opinion loudly. It's a careful, structured attempt to persuade someone, and it has to be built on a solid base of evidence and sound logical reasoning.
Right.
And understanding that arguments come in different shapes and sizes, and being aware of those common reasoning traps, the fallacies, is just essential. If you can grasp the basics of logic, know the different kinds of evidence and claims, and always think about your audience, you're going to be much better prepared.
Prepared both to build your own convincing arguments.
Yeah, and to critically evaluate all the arguments flying around you every single day.
Absolutely. So now hopefully you, our listener, have this new toolkit, a new lens to look at the information you encounter. You're better equipped to see the arguments being made underneath the surface and to judge how valid they really are.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Start noticing how these principles play out everywhere. In conversations with friends, in the news media, in advertising, even in your own head when you're making decisions. What claims are constantly being made around you? And maybe more importantly, what kind of evidence, if any, is being offered to back them up?
It really does change how you see the world once you start looking for the arguments. And hey, if any specific part of this sparked your interest, maybe a particular fallacy or how to evaluate evidence or the writing process itself, definitely dig deeper into that. There's always more to learn.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.